My mother tapped a silver spoon against her crystal champagne flute, and the chatter of 50 guests died instantly. It was my baby shower. Blue and white balloons arched over the gift table, and I was sitting in a velvet chair, 7 months pregnant, holding my husband's hand. Evelyn Sterling, a woman who never bought a piece of clothing off the rack, stood at the head of the room. She smiled at the guests, then looked directly at my stomach. "We are all so happy for Harper," my mother said, her voice carrying perfectly over the quiet room. "But Arthur and I have been discussing the future of the Sterling estate, and as much as we love this new baby, we all know she isn't real family blood. The family legacy, the name, the trust, that belongs to true Sterlings. We have to protect the bloodline." She said it with a soft, practiced smile. My husband David went rigid. 50 women from my mother's country club cub stared at their plates. My mother had just announced to a room full of people that my unborn daughter was a fake, a charity case, and financially cut off. I didn't cry. I didn't throw my punch in her face. I stood up, thanked the host, and walked out. What Evelyn didn't know, what nobody in that room could possibly comprehend, was that my mother's obsession with her pure bloodline was about to become the exact weapon that destroyed her. Because 3 weeks later, a plastic tube of saliva would expose a 40-year secret she had buried under our hardwood floors. And I was going to read it out loud to the entire family. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. This is the channel for the women who were told they didn't belong at the table, who stopped begging for a seat, and who ended up owning the whole dining room. If you've ever been the scapegoat of a family that cared more about its image than its children, you are in the exact right place. Drop a comment, tell me where you're listening from, and make sure you subscribe. You won't want to miss how this one ends. To understand the absolute audacity of my mother's toast, you have to understand the architecture of the Sterling family. I was adopted, or at least that was the story I had been fed since I was old enough to understand the word. Evelyn and Arthur Sterling had one biological son, my older brother Grant. Grant was 40, a junior partner at my father's corporate law firm, and the undisputed golden child. He had the Sterling jawline, the Sterling Trust Fund, and a wife who produced 2 perfect blonde Sterling sons. I was brought home when Grant was 10 years old. My parents told everyone I was a private adoption, a closed agency, a young mother who couldn't care for me. Growing up, the line between Grant and me wasn't just drawn. It was carved in concrete. Grant got a new car at 16. I got a bus pass. Grant's college was fully funded. I took out $80,000 in student loans to become a pediatric nurse. Whenever we had family portraits taken, Evelyn would place Grant and his children in the center, and I was always positioned at the very edge of the frame, easy to crop out. "Blood calls to blood, Harper," my mother used to say, whenever I asked why Grant's children received massive savings bonds while I received drugstore gift cards. It's nothing personal, it's just nature. I spent 29 years swallowing that excuse. I convinced myself that being chosen was enough, even if I was chosen to be the designated outsider. Then I got pregnant. When you are adopted with a closed file, pregnancy is terrifying. You sit in an obstetrician's office and they hand you a 4-page questionnaire about family medical history. Heart disease? Unknown. Cancers? Unknown. Genetic anomalies? Unknown. Every box checked with a question mark. After my mother's speech at the baby shower, the anxiety about my genetics peaked. If my child wasn't a Sterling, what was she? What was lurking in my DNA that I couldn't prepare for? 3 days after the shower, David found me sitting at the kitchen table crying over a blank medical history form. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He opened his laptop, ordered an advanced health and ancestry DNA kit, and paid for the expedited shipping. "We'll find out your health markers," David said gently,
and will leave your mother's pure bloodline exactly where it belongs, in the past. I did the cheek swab on a Tuesday. I dropped it in the mail and threw myself into setting up the nursery, painting the walls a soft sage green, trying to forget the silence that had fallen.
Over my family. My mother didn't call to apologize for the shower. My father, Arthur, sent one text that said, "Your mother is just traditional. Give her time." Grant didn't reach out at all. 3 weeks later, the email arrived. I was on my lunch break at the hospital, sitting in my car with the heater running. I clicked the link. The health markers loaded first. Everything was clear. No elevated risks, no genetic red flags. I breathed out a massive sigh of relief. Then I clicked on the tab labeled DNA Relatives. I wasn't looking for parents. I assumed my birth mother had never tested. But the algorithm loaded, and a name appeared at the very top of my match list. A name I saw every single day on the caller ID I ignored. Arthur Sterling. Predicted relationship? Father. Shared DNA? 50.1%. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. I refreshed the page. I closed the app and logged in through the browser. The numbers didn't change. Arthur Sterling, the man who had spent 29 years watching his wife treat me like a stray dog they'd taken in for charity, was my biological father. I sat in that parking garage, surrounded by the smell of sterile scrubs and cold coffee, and the entire puzzle of my childhood clicked into place with sickening clarity. I wasn't a private adoption. I was the product of an affair. My father had stepped out on Evelyn, gotten another woman pregnant, and brought his mistake home.
And Evelyn had stayed. She stayed for the money, the country club, the image. But she made a condition. I would be framed as an adopted orphan, and she would spend the next 3 decades punishing me for my father's sins, parading her pure biological son, Grant, as the only true heir. I gripped the steering wheel. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drive to their massive colonial house and throw a brick through the bay window. But I didn't. I am a nurse. I am trained to look at all the data before I deliver a diagnosis. My brother Grant had taken a DNA test 5 years ago. I remembered this clearly because Evelyn had bragged about it at Thanksgiving. Grant had done it to map his European ancestry, proud of the Sterling lineage that supposedly traced back to royalty. If Grant's profile was public, it would be in the database. I typed Grant's name into the search bar of my relative matches. No results found. I frowned. I removed the filters. I searched his exact profile handle. His page pulled up. The system allows you to compare your DNA directly with any public profile. I clicked the button to compare my genetics with my older brother. The screen loaded. Shared DNA. 0.0%. Predicted relationship? None. I stopped breathing.
The air in my car suddenly felt too thin to breathe. I read the numbers again. Arthur was my biological father, but Arthur was not Grant's biological father. For 40 years, Evelyn Sterling had lorded her pure bloodline over my head. She had humiliated me at my own baby shower, claiming my child was tainted and Grant's children were the true heirs. And all this time, her golden boy, the junior partner, the son who got the cars and the trust funds and the center of the photograph, was the product of her own affair. Evelyn had an affair 40 years ago and passed the boy off as Arthur's. 10 years later, Arthur had an affair and brought me home. They were both living in a house of absolute lies, but Evelyn had weaponized hers to destroy me. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I smiled. A slow, quiet smile that reached
all the way down to my bones. Because Evelyn Sterling had just handed me the match, and I was about to burn her entire stage to the ground. I waited 4 days. I didn't call. I didn't text. I let my mother believe her silence was punishing me. On Thursday, Arthur called. "Harper," he said, his voice sounding older than its 65 years. "Your mother wants to make peace before the baby comes. We're hosting a family dinner on Sunday. Grant will be there. We have some estate paperwork to formalize, but we want you there. Please." Estate paperwork. She was doing it. She was officially moving the trust to Grant's children. "I'll be there, Dad," I said.
Sunday evening. The Sterling dining room was a masterclass in intimidation. A mahogany table that seated 12, crystal wine glasses, a floral centerpiece that obscured the sightlines just enough to keep everyone slightly disconnected. Evelyn was at the head of the table, wearing a cashmere sweater, looking like the matriarch of an empire. Grant sat to her right, swirling a glass of Pinot Noir, his wife and 2 sons next to him. Arthur sat opposite Evelyn, looking thoroughly exhausted. I arrived precisely on time. I did not dress up. I wore a plain black maternity dress, and I carried a single thick manila folder. I set it gently on the table next to my water glass. "Harper, so glad you decided to join the family," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that usually makes me shrink. "I know the shower was emotional for you, but we have to be practical about the Sterling assets." "I completely agree, Mom," I said smoothly. Grant chuckled. "Mom's just looking out for the legacy, Harp. Nothing personal." "Right," Arthur cleared his throat. He pulled a leather portfolio from the sideboard. "Since we are all here, Evelyn and I have decided to restructure the Generation Skipping Trust. The primary beneficiaries will be Grant's boys. Harper, we are leaving you a lump sum, but the estate stays in the bloodline," Evelyn finished, folding her manicured hands over her plate. "It's the only honest way to do it." "Honest," I repeated. I let the word hang in the air until the silence became heavy. I looked at Arthur. "Dad, before you sign that trust, I think we should talk." Arthur flinched. It was microscopic, but I saw it. His hand tightened around his silver pen. I pulled out the first piece of paper and slid it to the center of the table. "This is my paternal match," I said. "Arthur Sterling. 50.1% shared DNA. I'm not a private adoption, am I, Dad? I'm your biological daughter." Grant's wine glass stopped halfway to his mouth. His wife gasped. Arthur's face drained of every drop of blood. He looked at the paper, then at Evelyn, who had suddenly gone as rigid as a statue. "Arthur," Grant whispered, looking at his father in shock. "It was 30 years ago," Grant choked out, his voice cracking. He couldn't look at me. "I made a mistake. Your mother agreed to take you in to avoid a scandal, but we swore we'd never tell." "And you let her punish me for it every day of my life," I said. "You let her treat your own flesh and blood like garbage to protect her pride." "I protected this family." Evelyn slammed her hand on the table. The crystal rattled. Her face was flushed dark red. "I stayed. I raised his bastard child. I endured the humiliation of looking at your face every day. Don't you dare sit in my house and judge me. Grant is the only pure thing in this family." I looked at my mother. I looked at the woman who had starved me of affection for 3 decades. And I pulled out the second piece of paper. "That brings me to the second part of the DNA test," I said quietly. I slid the paper.
"But I also ran a comparison between Grant and Arthur." The dining room went into a vacuum. The kind of silence where the world simply stops spinning. 0%, Dad, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Grant is not your biological son. He never was. Arthur stared at the paper. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at the bold black numbers. Shared DNA, 0.0%. That's a lie, Evelyn hissed, standing up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the floor. That is a fabricated, malicious lie. You forged that to steal the trust. I printed it directly from the database, Evelyn, I said, dropping the title Mom for the first time in my life. Grant, you can log into your app right now. Go ahead, check your paternal matches. Arthur isn't on there. He never has been. Grant yanked his phone out of his pocket. His hands were shaking violently. He opened the app. I watched his eyes scan the screen. I watched the exact moment a 40-year-old lie collapsed onto his shoulders. He looked up at Evelyn, his face twisted in horror.
Mom, Grant whispered. Mom, what is this? Arthur finally moved. He slowly looked up from the paper and turned his head toward Evelyn. The exhaustion that had weighed him down for years was gone, replaced by a cold, terrifying stillness. 40 years, Arthur said. His voice didn't shake. It was dead. You held my mistake over my head for 30 years. You made me beg for your forgiveness. You made me watch you torture my daughter. And you knew your own son wasn't mine? Evelyn backed away from the table. Arthur, it was one time. Before we were married, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know for sure until he was older. You made me disinherit her. Arthur stood up. The leather portfolio holding the trust documents fell to the floor. You told me it was the only way to make things right. You told me the bloodline mattered. It does, Evelyn cried, desperation clawing at her throat. He's still your son, Arthur. He's the one you raised. So is she, Arthur roared, pointing at me. The sound rattled the windows. But you made sure she never felt like it. I zipped up my bag. I had done what I came to do. I didn't need to watch the rest of the execution. I had already dropped the guillotine. I don't want your money, Dad, I said, turning away from the table. I never did. I just wanted a father. But I'm going to be a mother soon, and I refuse to let my daughter anywhere near a family built on this much poison. The fallout over the next 2 months was biblical. Arthur didn't just cancel the generation-skipping trust. He filed for divorce. The proceedings tore open every financial secret Evelyn had been hiding. Without Arthur's income and the protection of the Sterling name, Evelyn was forced to move out of the massive colonial house and into a rented condo on the other side of town. Grant's entire identity shattered. He had built his ego on being the Sterling heir. When the truth got out, and in a law firm, the truth always gets out, his confidence dissolved. Arthur didn't fire him, but the dynamic was ruined. Grant ended up transferring to a smaller firm in another state, taking his pure bloodline with him. And Arthur? 3 days after my daughter was born, Arthur showed up at my hospital room. He didn't bring an entourage. He didn't bring Evelyn. He brought a single bouquet of yellow tulips and a notarized legal document. He had dissolved the old trust entirely and created a new one. The sole beneficiary of the Sterling estate was my daughter. I spent 30 years being a coward, Arthur said, standing at the foot of my hospital bed, tears finally spilling over his weathered cheeks. I let her convince me that protecting my reputation was more important than protecting you. I can't fix that.
but I can make sure your daughter never spends a single day of her life feeling like she isn't enough. I let him hold her. It was a start. It wasn't forgiveness. That takes decades to earn. But it was truth. And truth is the only foundation you can actually build a family on. My mother spent 30 years trying to convince the world I was an outsider, a charity case with bad blood. In the end, she was the one who had to pack her bags and leave the estate. Some people will tell you that blood is thicker than water, but I learned that the truth is thicker than both. And if you ever try to weaponize someone's identity against them, you had better be absolutely sure your own closet doesn't have a glass door,